Let's do this. Now we're going to take a look at some few examples of evidence to support Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, and then a couple of examples that we can continue to see here in the modern day of natural selection at work. And then we're going to wrap up with just a few comments about what we think has gone on in terms of human evolution, but that, as we'll see, is very hypothetical. So the first piece of evidence of Darwin's evolution is the fossil record, right? I mentioned in the previous video that Darwin understood that fossils found at deeper levels of rock came from older, more ancestral organisms than those found at more shallow levels. And when he compared the fossils at different layers, he found differences, but he found a lot of similarities as well. And that goes all the way to, species that are alive today. And so studying the various layers of fossils allows us to kind of form a hypothesis as to how these organisms have changed over time as well. We also have what we call geographic distribution. So in other words, where do we find certain organisms? So first, a couple things to add to your notes here, sort of. First thing is, what we would typically refer to as divergent evolution. And this is sort of kind of what most people would think of as like typical evolution, right? Different species and different locations have descended from a common ancestor, but they've modified in different ways. So you've got an ancestor, and then it has split into species 1 and species 2 because they live in different environments. And so those, what we would call environmental pressures or selective pressures, have caused them to become something different. Now, you guys maybe also have heard before of something called convergent evolution. So if you recall from earlier, we mentioned that fitness is relative, right? And it depends upon your environment. So Darwin also suggests that in some places on the planet, maybe we are seeing two very similar organisms that are really different and descended from different ancestors. They've just modified to fit a similar environment very well. So basically, we've got ancestor 1, ancestor 2, and they've become species 1 and species 2, but these are really similar to each other. And it's because their environments are similar. So if you look at this picture, for instance, in North America, we're going to see beavers. In South America, we can see a very similar organism as they have pictured here called a capybara. We're pretty sure today, genetically in things, these two are not that similar, meaning that they probably don't have real strong common ancestry. What we think is that they've turned into two things that are really similar to each other just because their environments are similar. They're on very different parts of the globe, but their environments are similar. Another example that you guys might be familiar with is flying squirrels and sugar gliders. They are very, very similar organisms, but they are not real closely related. We think the same thing happened there, where they converged into a similar organism because their environments were similar environments. Then we have the idea of homologous structures or homologous body structures. Homologous structures are, as it says here, structures that have a different mature form but develop from the same embryonic tissues. In other words, they are similar structures because of genetic similarity between organisms. Right, so a long time ago, scientists thought, well, hey, this organism has wings and that organism has wings. They must be similar, even if we're talking about like a bat and a bird and an insect. Today we understand better than that, right? But if we see two structures that are similar and they have similar kind of genetic lineage, then we realize this might be evidence of more common ancestry. So for instance, in this picture, what it's showing you is when we look at a lot of different vertebrates, right, animals with backbones, they have really similar limb structures. And on the outside, this limb structure looks different. It's modified to fit that animal better. So something like a bird wing, this kind of typical mammalian leg, like you might see in a deer, alligator leg, whale fin could be on here, could be another one. But when you look at, wow, that looks nothing like whale. When you look at the internal structure, the internal anatomy is actually really similar. And so that's what they're showing you here with these different colors is although the bone structure is a little different, the anatomy itself is fairly similar. And then we have embryological similarity. All right, the embryonic stages, the really early stages of life, developmental stages inside of the mother and things. These are also really similar for most vertebrates. So here in this picture, we've got, a chicken versus a turtle versus a rat or something like that. And, they all have a very big similarity. And honestly, we could put a developmental human over here as well, and we'd see a really similar thing in those embryonic stages. And so scientists suggest that this again kind of supports the idea that maybe we all have a common ancestry, and it is through that developmental process that we become different. But those early similarities in our structures, kind of hard to deny. Okay, and so now we're going to look at a couple of examples of Darwin's evolution. So I mentioned last time that Darwin studied tortoises and marine iguanas and finches. And although the tortoises are kind of the most well-known thing, he documented a lot more about the iguanas and the finches. And the finches especially are an interesting case, right? And so Darwin looked at these various Galapagos Island finches, and he observed that they had different shaped beaks. And so we've got this little table that came out of an older version of your all's textbook here, where we're categorizing, in this case, 6 different kinds of finch, right? And so common names here vary, but they're all kind of based on what they eat and where they live, right? So this vegetarian tree finch is going to be a finch that eats primarily fruit and is found living amongst kind of fruit-bearing trees, and it has a particular shape of beak. And then each one is a little bit different, you see. Now, Darwin says that each of these birds, although they are different species today, came from a common ancestor on the South American mainland. And what we would maybe see, all right, is if we've got sort of, if you think of this as our mainland, and you've got these islands out here, right? What we might see is that the birds make their way to an island, right? And then they become isolated. And isolation is the name of the game, right? That is the key. If birds become isolated on an island where they can only reproduce with the other birds on that island, then we can start to see a shift into something different, right? Of something that we call speciation, right? A change into a new species. And what Darwin suggested is that these birds moved out to these islands, became isolated, and the shapes of their beaks sort of changed to best suit that island. Now, for most people, the question is, how did they change? So how they changed is where natural selection comes in. Please don't follow a misconception here. A bird itself, the beak is not going to change. Right, so you're not going to have this bird that flies out to this island, right, with this kind of shaped beak, and then it's going to turn into a totally different shape. That doesn't happen, right? What we have to look at is how good is this first bird at surviving on a particular island. So to kind of break it down with more specifics, let's say a bird with a long, skinny beak, something more like this one, right, or these top two. They're better suited at picking bugs from the bark of trees, whether their beak will just fit into the tree bark, or they might use a tool to pick into the bark and get insects. But birds with thick, strong beaks, like these we see down here, right? They aren't very good at picking bugs out of tree bark. They can't handle a little tool. Their beak doesn't fit into a hole. But what they can do is they can use brute force and break open seeds. So, On an island where tough seeds are the main food, only these two birds will survive better, right? And on that same island, the thin-beaked birds cannot break open seeds. They don't eat, so they die off. And the thick-beaked birds are the only ones that reproduce. And if you think about that, when these thick-beaked birds reproduce, their future generations are going to have thick beaks. So after a period of time, these birds are going to be the only beak shape we see on a particular island because they're the only ones reproducing. And again, it's not that that original bird changed its beak. It's just that some birds could survive and reproduce and some birds cannot. And the shape of their beak to start with was all just because of the genetics they had when they were born. Another example that is a little bit more current and is actually a scientific experiment that is still ongoing is the example of the peppered moths, scientifically known as Biston bechellaria. And these peppered moths have been studied for really a couple hundred years now. And scientists have been able to watch them change because of natural selection. Now, there are a lot of opponents to natural selection or to evolution who say, you know, evolution takes so long, we could never possibly see it happen. Well, they are just not right, right? We've got tons of examples of bacterial evolution that we can see almost in a matter of weeks. The current pandemic coronavirus issue that we're dealing with is sort of an example of an evolving thing. And so we see that all the time, but then a lot of people say, okay, so something simple like bacteria can evolve, but we can't possibly see a large organism evolve. And I'll be honest, it's hard to get data that really supports a human evolution process. Again, because it would take so long, but we can see some things, and these moths are a really cool example. So Biston bechellaria, these peppered moths come in two types. You've got a lighter colored version called the salt and pepper moth, and you've got a dark, almost black version that you see here. Right? And so basically these moths can come in either of these colorations. Now, a couple hundred years ago, the light-colored moths far outnumbered the dark-colored neighbors. I'm making up these numbers, but let's just say, you got 90% light ones and about 10% dark ones. And the reason was because of camouflage. All right, these moths lived around trees that were often covered in lichens. And if you don't really know what a lichen is, I bet you have seen them before. They tend to grow on trees. So if you ever wandered around the woods before, you probably saw some lichens growing on the bark. And if you look at this picture, it's a great example of this. So this is a tree that's covered in lichens. Not hard to see the dark-colored moth here, right? But I went ahead and put this circle on the picture because it's so hard to actually see this light salt and pepper colored moth that's sitting there on the bark next to it, right? So the dark moths stand out like Christmas lights, right, for primarily bats and some birds that would prey on these. So the dark moths are a lot more likely to get eaten by their predators because they don't blend in, while the light moths do blend in, and it's harder for the predators to see them. So, right, the light-colored moths have an easier time surviving and reproducing. Most of their offspring also going to be light in color. So over a period of time, you get a breakdown like this. Now the story continues. Right, during the Industrial Revolution, there was so much pollution and the air quality was so bad in the areas of England and a couple of different European locations where this study takes place, that the lichens on the trees began to die and fall off. And on top of that, the exposed tree bark would be covered with soot, And you'd get a background or an environment that looks more like this. Well, now look at it. Right now, what is fit has shifted. Remember, it's all about relative fitness. When the background was light, it was good to be a light colored moth. They were higher fitness. But when the background becomes dark, now they're the ones that stand out. And now the dark ones have higher fitness. So what do you think happened? Yeah, if you guessed that there was a shift in the moths, you were correct. It went to a situation where it was almost the total opposite. It was like 90% dark, 10% light. But we can keep going. Right, today, improvements to sanitation, right? Better air quality, not nearly the air pollution that we saw during the Industrial Revolution, has allowed a lot of the lichens to grow back onto trees again. And now, these selective pressures, again, is what we would call them in the environment, have shifted back toward favoring the light-colored moths. Now, as far as I know, it's not exactly like all the way back to, such a high percentage of salt and pepper moths versus dark moths, but it has shifted back to where the light moths are more common because the environment tends to look a bit more like this again. So again, natural selection, right, in the environment put what we call selective pressure on these moths, changing the color that was fit, and we saw a shift in response to that. And again, it has nothing to do with one moth changing, right? It's just a matter of which moths are more likely to survive and reproduce offspring, which will probably be more like themselves. All right, so let's take a minute to talk about human and primate evolution. I bring this up because I think a lot of people kind of misunderstand what scientists believe about human evolution. And for a number of years, when I was a new teacher, I would have students ask me about this. And this was kind of deeper in the textbook than we ever got. And so just a couple years ago, I added a couple slides and just a couple comments about human evolution to try and help people understand a little bit more about what's involved there. So first, let's ask the question, what is a primate? Right, because we are primates. Right? Primates are mammals. They have a well-developed cerebrum, so it's kind of like the front part of your brain, gives you more cognition, more thought processes than other animals. Primates can rotate their forearms, so in your forelimbs. So your arms, right, you can rotate around a really strong shoulder and clavicle or collarbone. Fun little example you can do here. If you have a dog or cat at home, go grab him or her and be very gentle, all right, nice to your dog and things. But notice how he or she is different than you, right? And this rotating arms one is a fun one. And again, you want to be gentle. I don't want you to hurt your pet at all. But I can take my little dog Samson, right? And his front shoulders, they're strong. He's a little, Boston Terrier. So he's a little muscle-bound dog. But if I try to take his arms and like rotate them at all, he doesn't like that, right? And they just don't do it. They don't move that way. But you can take your arms and make big arm circles, right? Like you were swimming the butterfly or whatever, because your shoulders have a larger range of motion. That's a primate thing. You also have long fingers and toes with more flattened nails versus sharp claws. Again, look at your dog or cat. Look at their little kind of stubby fingers that they have on their hands and feet, on their paws, compared to your hands. And then you also have front-facing eyes, or binocular vision, meaning that you put the two pictures together into one picture. This is strange to think about, but if you think about, like, particularly a fish, right? A fish has two eyes on the opposite sides of its head, of its body. What does it see? Like, we don't know. We can't even conceptualize that. And a lot of times, something like your dog is the same way, right? They do somewhat have forward-facing eyes, but not like we do, right? And not like this chimp and this lemur in this picture, and that is a primate thing. Now, I want to be super clear. I know this is really blurry in this picture that I tried to scan in, but, no one is saying that we came from any of the other primates. And that's a bad misconception. I think I mentioned at the start of the year, really don't like that picture, that famous picture from Time magazine where it has like the chimp walking and becoming more like a caveman and then walking and becoming more like a modern man or whatever. I really don't like that because that leads people to think, oh, you're saying that this gorilla woke up one day and was like, dude, now I'm a human. It doesn't work that way, right? In fact, scientists would suggest that we didn't directly come from any of the other apes that are on the planet right now. What we're saying, though, is that these other primates have a more recent common ancestor than we have with our dogs or cats or turtles or whatever, right? But the common ancestor that we share with the other primates, scientists suggest probably existed about 65 million years ago. So this common primate ancestor was probably 65 million years ago. And then it branched into all these different types of primate, the lemurs, tarsiers, the New World and Old World monkeys, and then the hominoids that we're about to talk about more. But even this, right? See this common ancestor with chimpanzees? We're probably still talking about millions of years ago that was true. Now, that group on that last picture, the hominoids, or I usually refer to them as hominids, are sometimes called the great apes. These are 5 specific primates. The gibbons, we used to have a couple gibbons in the islands exhibit over there at the Louisville Zoo. Orangutans, which we also have there. Gorillas, which we have the nice gorilla forest. Chimpanzees, which unfortunately we don't have at the Louisville Zoo. And then humans. Now, we believe that 6 to 7 million years ago, again, huge scope here, a lineage split from that common ancestor to become chimpanzees, which is our most closely related extant relative. Extant means currently existing, right? Versus extinct, right? Which would mean currently gone. And this branching 6 to 7 million years ago gave rise to chimps and gave rise to what are called the hominines. Now notice, I'm still not saying human here, right? So 6 to 7 million years ago, MYA, million years ago, we had some kind of common ancestor, now extinct, right? So this guy's gone, that gave rise to the chimps and the hominines. Now, the hominines are a little closer to us, but they're still not us. Now, the hominin group have a few more specific differences that you can kind of try out yourself here, right? We have skeletal changes that lead to a couple things. We have skeletal changes that allow us to be more erect, so we stand more upright, right? And we tend to walk bipedally, meaning with 2 feet. Now, this is some skeletal changes in our hips, in our backbone, in our knees, in our ankles and feet, and even in our head. Right? Like it says here, the skull has a different shape that allows us to be more upright. Right? We also have opposable thumbs. Now, if you ever look at a gorilla hand or something, it also has the same number of fingers and has a thumb on each one. But the thumb is just kind of smaller and off to the side. What you can do, though, and you can try it right now, is you can touch your thumb to all your different fingertips. That's called an opposable thumb. We're really the only thing on the planet that can do that, right? And have so much dexterity in our hands. And then we have substantially larger brains as well, which again allow for more thought, deeper thinking, like planning and those kind of things that we typically don't really see in other species. Now, this is where we get really hypothetical. So just a cute picture of Eric when he was a baby. I was trying to figure out how to open a bottle. Human evolution from this point forward is very, very hypothetical. We know a lot in the fossil record, but it's really hard to understand exactly how we got from this 6 to 7 million years ago hominin split to current modern day Homo sapiens. Now, scientists have laid out 7 different hominin genera. So we haven't talked classification yet, but genus, right? There's genus and then species. So there's 7 different genera of hominines, and that includes us, right? The genus Homo, but then also the genera Sahelanthropus, Auroran, Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and Kenyanthropus. Now, the oldest hominine fossil skull, which was actually a type of Sahelanthropus, was found in Africa about 7 million years ago. So that's how we time out that branch point, we think, with the chimpanzees. But, these other genera have come to be in these 7 million years at some point, these last 7 million years. And they're still not thought of to be our direct ancestor, right? They are thought of to be our relatives. These other genera, like Ardipithecus, you can think more of like those are our cousins or something. They're not our direct ancestor. Now, most of these other genera and species lived several millions of years, at least that's what the fossil record tells us, before humans would come around. And they actually came and went, right? So all of these other species are currently extinct, right? We are the only members of that hominine group. We're the only members of any of these genera that still exist today, which means we don't have a really close relative on the planet, right? The things that we came from have since gone extinct, and we are the only current extant one that remains. And again, we have some similarity to other great apes like chimps, but we're really not that closely related because there's still these millions of years and these different intervening species that were there in between. Right now, we do think that there have been several other members of the genus Homo that existed prior to our current species, Homo sapiens. And these other members of the genus Homo probably existed in the last, million years or so, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. And yet, we are the only ones that have survived to this point. The genus Homo, we think, started in Africa. That's where the first fossils have been found, but then migrated to inhabit parts of Europe and parts of Asia. And then, obviously, now it has spread to the Americas as well. Now, this is also a terrible scan, but this gives you an idea of the timeline of hominine species in terms of where they were found in the fossil record. So we mentioned earlier Sahelanthropus here is the one where we found the skull dating back about 7 million years ago. And then these little green bars tell you how long we think they survived. So we think that Sahelanthropus, because we kept finding fossils, was around for about 1 million years. Right? Others were around much shorter times. Like this Kenyanthropus right here pops up, about 3.5 million years ago or so, and is only around for maybe a couple 100,000 years. Now then, all these ones that are H something are different members of our genus, most of which have gone extinct. Right, so we had Homo erectus. Maybe you've heard that one before. Homo erectus, we believe, lived for almost 2 million years on our planet, but went extinct before we came around, or around the time that we came around. And then you see us, who we only believe have been around for a very short period of time, about 100,000 years, and we don't really know how long we'll keep going before maybe there is something different. Something that's kind of interesting to think about, though, too, is that, when Homo sapiens first arrived on the planet, there were other members of the genus Homo. There was Homo neanderthalis, there was Homo erectus, there was Homo floresiensis. And that's interesting to think about, right? That maybe there was a time where there were different human-like species on our planet. Now, the development of modern human, we think, has happened in the last couple 100,000 years. Again, a ridiculously large amount of time, right? But fossils suggest that Homo neanderthalis, that we mentioned on the last slide, began to show technological advancement. So, making tools, being able to control fire, evidence of social structure, evidence of working together for hunting, gathering, and those sort of things that, again, we see kind of in the archaeological record. And then fossils suggest that the modern Homo sapiens, like us, showed up about 100,000 years ago. And modern Homo sapiens showed large increases in technological advancement. Much fancier tools, complicated cave art like you see in these pictures, elaborate social structures, communication advances, and things like that. So again, the human stuff here is really just kind of for your information, and hopefully that kind of gives you a little better picture of what we think human evolution has been like, and that we didn't just wake up one day and start from the chimpanzee. But again, keep in mind most of this is pretty hypothetical, and will probably continue to change as we move forward and learn more and more. So that wraps up evolution for us. Thanks for listening.